Hey everyone, it's Michael Douglas. Welcome to this edition of Dr. Pundit, where we talk about music, not medicine. And on this edition of the show, we'll be premiering a brand new segment called Remember When. This is where I look at a moment within a musical act or the movement within popular music itself that resulted in a moment, some sort of sentinel change or watershed, or maybe just an era of acknowledgement that, however briefly enacted, caused a bit of a stir before things resume back to normal. A musical moment, so to speak. And on this edition of the show, I'll be talking about the band Duran Duran. And when they split into two competing bands, for lack of a better description. So let's get into it. Duran Duran made a mint for a lot of people in the music industry in the decade of the 1980s, the early 80s to mid 80s, their biggest years, which is why they were pretty much given carte blanche to do whatever they wanted to. Now, who would have guessed what they really wanted to do was to split up into two different bands, each of whom released a super expensive album in the year 1985. This is a brief look at two splinter bands of Duran Duran, Power Station and Arcadia, two bands that were essentially used as palate cleansers by members of Duran Duran so they could get back into the business of being the most popular band in the world. And of course, you guessed it, this could have only happened in the decade of excess, the 1980s, right smack dab in the middle of that decade. Now, fans of Duran Duran who heard the band were in two different factions by 1985. The split was more or less planned, as was the notion that the members would quickly reunite. That much was put out there for fans, so there was really no need for them to panic that this band would be no more. Perhaps the main catalyst for these side projects were the sessions for the hit 1983 album Seven and the Ragged Tiger, during which bassist John Taylor fretted over the fussiness of the sound. This was the album that gave us the top 10 hits New Moon on Monday, Union of the Snake, and the #1 smash, The Reflex. Now, wanting to rock, he enlisted fellow Duran member Andy Taylor to play lead guitar. Long a fan of the R&B band Chic, Nile Rodgers, the men nabbed Tony Thompson to play the drums, who was a part of Chic, and former Chic band member Bernard Edwards was the producer. The trio initially thought that they'd use rotating lead singers, but when Robert Palmer walked in and sang the hell out of an instrumental track that the trio had already recorded, well, it led to one of the hits from the album, a classic remake of the T-Rex song, Bang a Gong, Get It On. Now, in March of 1985, the debut album from the Power Station arrived with the hit single Some Like It Hot. Of course, the aforementioned Bang a Gong, Get It On followed at hit number 9. And on the heels of Thompson's thunderous percussion and drums, it ruled MTV all summer long. One could argue it should have been, at least a top 5 hit. It was everywhere. But this low-key Duran war was just only beginning to heat up. Now, perhaps all you need to know to get a sense of the music that these competing outfits were making is to look at the band names they chose. The Power Station was the name of the studio where the Taylors and their new cohorts recorded the album. And it also suggested, power. Arcadia, the name chosen by Duran lead singer Simon Le Bon and keyboardist Nick Rhodes, was taken from a painting found in the Louvre and suggested, ancient myths, maybe? In the aftermath of its making, Le Bon and Rhodes would call Arcadia's album So Red the Rose, pretentious. Now, while they're being partly tongue-in-cheek about this, it's undeniable. The music from the November 1985 release by Arcadia was somewhat elusive, atmospheric, and clearly made to please the whims of the makers, with the hope that the audience would soon follow along. The fact that Rhodes and Le Bon chose the same producer, Alex Sadkin, who had infuriated John Taylor on Seven and the Ragged Tiger, should tell you how their sensibilities diverged from the Power Station camp. Now, although Duran Duran drummer Roger Taylor was listed as a member of Arcadia, he wasn't used on the entire album. And adding to the confusion, he also contributed to the Power Station as well. LeBone and Rhodes used a series of ace session men to fill out the roster on Arcadia, while enlisting special guests like Sting, David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, believe it or not, and Herbie Hancock. On the brassy top 10 single Election Day, Grace Jones even performs a spoken word section. So what was the aftermath of these two side projects? Andy and John Taylor hoped the Power Station would endure, but Palmer's decision not to tour likely squashed that. The writing was on the wall for that project. They reunited for a 1996 album, which was wholly inferior, called Living in Fear. It went unnoticed. Sadly, Edwards passed away later that year, and Robert Palmer and Tony Thompson died in 2003. Arcadia, on the other hand, was always intended as a one-off. Rose did admit in an interview with the website superdeluxeedition.com, Simon and I have only talked about it in jest. The only time it's ever arisen is when one of us says, if we save up all the money we earn for the next 10 years, we could make an Arcadia record. When Duran Duran returned for their 1986 album Notorious, which had a heavy R&B bent to it, they were two men down. Roger Taylor, semi-retired, and while Andy Taylor played on just a few tracks before going for a brief solo career. So what was the gist of all of this? The too long don't read version? Well, it turned out that the Power Station and the Arcadia era may have exposed more fissures in the group than they even realized at the time. But now that both albums are included by Duran Duran in their unofficial canon, it also suggests that all is forgiven. And if you don't believe me, go to streaming services and take a look inside the discographies of Duran Duran, and you'll see that as well. But this split really wasn't a split, even though I recall this at the time I was a senior in high school. We knew, because I was a very big Duran Duran fan, that these were one-offs and that they were mostly indulgences, that they were basically asking big fans like myself, hey, what do you think? We're going to go back to doing what we normally do, but strike while the iron's hot. And looking back on it, yeah, it was kind of cool, I suppose. And in the long run, it really didn't hurt the band or the band's mystique or standing. Duran Duran was clearly one of the most influential bands of the 1980s, and that designation has only gotten stronger over time. So, hey, I get it and I understand, and I hope you do too after hearing this. Remember When, the inaugural segment right here on Dr. Pundit. I'm Michael Douglas, and if you like what you see here, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. And as the late, great Barry White always used to say, let the music play, and I'll see you on the next episode.